Why triggers still arise on the spiritual path. A talk with Unmani.
So I thought to speak a little bit about what happens when we are triggered, because this seems to be really an area that comes up again and again for all of us, because it's so natural to be triggered. So what is it to be triggered, first of all? Well, we use this word triggered, and it sounds like, pulling the trigger of a gun, and it can feel like that sometimes. When we have a response, a reaction in the body to a certain situation or circumstances, and the body goes into some kind of response that feels out of control or even unrelated somehow on some level to what is actually happening. It seems to propel us into some past story or a past memory, past physical memory even. And it clouds our vision and our perception and our way of seeing clearly how we can respond to that situation. It really blinds us from our usual way of being present and responsive. Yeah, and so this is why it can feel very frustrating when we are triggered, especially if it happens often, or especially if there are certain triggers that repeat again and again. And even if we look deeply into the causes or the original story or the original trauma or memory, sometimes this trigger can go on and on and on. Each time we're in a situation that is in some way related to that original memory. And it may not be related in a logical way. It can just be somehow that this body finds it relatable. And maybe the mind doesn't really even understand. Why are you doing this again? Especially when we've been on the spiritual path for a long time and we've been trying to fix ourselves and heal ourselves and work on ourselves so intensely. And yet still we find ourselves in a messy situation where we're triggered as if we've never done any work on ourselves at all. It can almost be embarrassing and humiliating. Yeah, for this identity of the spiritual one, right? The one who has achieved a certain level of spirituality, which of course is silly. But this is what can happen. This can cause some shame and embarrassment. And then we try to suppress and hide these kind of reactions, which only feeds the reaction, gives it even more power because we make it a problem, we make it wrong, because it's somehow disturbing who we are trying to be or who we believe ourselves to be. Yeah. So just let's take an example just so that we can kind of tune into the kind of thing that we are talking about here. And of course, we can take a small example, but this can also be on a much bigger scale as well. And I'm sure you can recognize it in your own experience, in your own way. So, for example, a friend of yours, doesn't invite you to their birthday party. And maybe when you hear about it from somebody else, ooh, it can hurt, right? First of all, yeah, it can hurt, and it can also trigger a response a reaction of anger, perhaps, a feeling of being excluded, a sense of I don't belong. Yeah, there's something wrong with me. And it can bring us back to perhaps childhood memories at school, maybe, when our friends excluded us in playing a game. And when we were children, the way we dealt with that was maybe we threw some kind of tantrum, maybe we stormed off in a huff, maybe we went quiet and just stayed really quiet and alone and isolated. Maybe we played it cool, like it didn't mean anything, but really inside we were hurting a lot. Maybe somewhere we just went numb and and the anger that we felt was just pushed down. Maybe it came out later in the day or in some other circumstance. Maybe it built up slowly, lots of bits of anger, and came out in one big explosion later on. So we deal with these things in lots of different ways as children. In a way, as children, often, maybe not always, but we can be a little bit more honest or raw with our response. But then as adults, this way of responding is usually not considered okay or socially acceptable or certainly not spiritual. And so we have another layer that comes over that initial trigger that tells the story of, I should be past this, I should be beyond this, or, I shouldn't care. Or even jumping to the conclusion of well, I'm not going to invite them anymore, which, well, perhaps that's still a bit of a childish response as well. But we have our layers on top of these reactions that try to push it away or suppress it in some way. And this just builds it even more. So then the question is, well, how do we deal with this? Right? How do we deal with these triggers, especially ones that are repeating? So I would say, first of all, we look at this outer layer of believing that it's a problem, believing that I should be beyond that, or I shouldn't react in that way anymore. Because that idea of I should is just feeding an identity that isn't true. Yeah. Whether it's a spiritual identity or whether it's an identity of being super cool or, a good friend or, whatever it is, some kind of identity. And we can question this identity, and we can also see that actually whatever the response is, the reaction is, it is happening out of our control in that moment. And that can feel frustrating that it's happening out of control. The thinking wants to come in and control it and make it fit into a nice reaction that we would approve of according to our identity. So this reaction is happening out of control, so we are not to blame for it. Right? We're not doing something wrong. If you could control it, you wouldn't do that, but you can't control it. It's just happening. And so there's an innocence in that, an innocence in meeting this reaction as it is, seeing that it's happening out of control, and so therefore doesn't mean anything about who you are. It doesn't make you unspiritual or a bad person. It is just the response of this body according to an old memory. And so first we see that it's not our fault and it's not a problem, and we have done nothing wrong. And then we can start to be curious about the reaction itself. What was the trigger? What was the initial spark? Okay, you weren't invited to the friend's birthday where you felt that you should have been. And how did that feel in the body when that first pain? And so we can stay curious with that, feeling the pain of that and noticing the thought story that comes in with that, giving that initial wound a story of what it means about me. This means that I don't belong. This means I'm excluded. They don't like me. I'm a bad person, or whatever. Noticing that one. And I'm not saying that we can necessarily notice all of this in the moment, because in the moment that it's happening, we're kind of blinded. So it's more about looking back at it and having some insight into it afterwards. And the more insight we have into it afterwards, we may notice that the next time that we are triggered in that way, it might have just a slight more space around that trigger. It's not that it's a magic wand that it just suddenly disappears, but it can just bring a little bit more distance from that identification with it. Especially when we see that it's not a problem. So we're just staying curious with it and watching how this trigger unfolds, how the reaction unfolds in the body, in the mind, in the emotions. Forgiving ourselves at every moment. It doesn't mean anything about who I am. And staying with the sensations, allowing the wave of the sensations in all its phases. And it may change. Inevitably, it will change. It might move from anger to pain to frustration to or different phases of more intense pain or more subtle, just a little movement of energy. You might have deeper beliefs that reveal themselves. It might trigger specific memories that you can look at and feel into. But none of it is in order to get rid of this trigger. We're not trying to fix it. We're not trying to heal it. We're just seeing how we can meet it and embrace it. Because in embracing it, this in itself actually supports this process to have a little bit more space within it. And in seeing that it is all like an animal response, a natural response of this body, of this nervous system to certain threatening situations or perceived threatening situations, that all we can do is ride that wave because we are animals and these reactions are normal, especially if we've had some traumas in the past. Then no doubt these will be played out again in our lives. But as we keep meeting them and embracing them, They can be here. They're just part of what it is to be human, this human animal. We don't need to keep trying to clean it all up, make it all some kind of perfect state. Actually, it's just about making friends with these old friends that are these triggers, these wounds that get touched every so often. And as we are embracing them more and more, they can slowly soften, even though they never need to. They slowly become so part of our experience, so included and so welcome that there never seem to be a problem. It's just like, okay, here's a wave coming, right? Away, we're going to ride that wave. When we don't believe our thoughts about these things as much as is possible, right? It's not always possible immediately. Often we have to go round and round and round with certain triggers until we can have more and more insight into the process of them, how they work, not even necessarily why. Some aspect of why is interesting, may be helpful to a point, but just looking at how they unfold, each unfolding, each part of this process, each micro movement. It's actually really beautiful to meet. Even if the mind says, come on, I want to be over it by now, but still meet it. Allow it. Let the body move in the way it wants to move. Sometimes we have stopped the body in some way when we were younger. And now with that reaction, it wants to move in a different, maybe weird kind of way. And we can allow it. Noticing the breath with it. Maybe the breath needs to do something different. When it's not controlled so much by the mind or suppressed or tried to fix or change, then this body can do what it wants to do, what it needs to do, which is out of control, and that's okay.